Let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Joshua chapter 17. And this morning we will be looking at verses 7 through 18 in the text, making our way through the book of Joshua and wrapping up chapter 17 this morning. Joshua chapter 17 and verse 7. The territory of Manasseh reached from Asher to Mikmethath, which is east of Shechem. Then the boundary goes along southward to the inhabitants of En-Tappuah. The land of Tappuah belonged to Manasseh, but the town of Tappuah on the boundary of Manasseh belonged to the people of Ephraim. Then the boundary went down to the brook of Kanah. These cities to the south of the brook among the cities of Manasseh belonged to Ephraim. Then the boundary of Manasseh goes on the north side of the brook and ends at the sea, the land of the south being Ephraim's, and that to the north being Manasseh's, with the sea forming its boundary. On the north, Asher is reached, and on the east, Issachar. Also in Issachar and in Asher, Manasseh and Bethshean and its villages, and Ibleam and its villages, and the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, and the inhabitants of Endor and its villages, and the inhabitants of Taanach and its villages, the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. The third is Naphath. Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of those cities, but the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. Now when the people of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. Then the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, "Why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, although I am a numerous people, since all along the Lord has blessed me?" Joshua said to them, "If you are a numerous people, go up by yourselves to the forest, and there clear ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you." The people of Joseph said, "The hill country is not enough for us, yet all the Canaanites who dwell in the plain have chariots of iron, and both those in Bethshean and the villages and those in the valley of Jezreel." Then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are a numerous people and have great power. You shall not have one allotment only, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess it. It is to its farthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong." This is the word of the Lord. I remember very distinctly, and I was probably, 10 or 11 years old, going to a Christmas party at my grandparents' house. You guys have all been to these Christmas parties. They're fun. And all the kids gathered around the tree and were handed presents. And as a child, this is pretty much the most exciting thing that you could ever, experience. So, and you've been waiting all year, right, for your present. And so finally the day had come, and you're there, you're ready to receive your promised gift. And my turn finally had arrived, and I received my package. I noticed it was relatively small, but that was okay because I knew big things could come in small packages. My mother always told me that. Great big things can come in small packages, so I wasn't dismayed. But I did exactly what kids do, and I tore off the wrapping paper and examined the box. And after I tore off the wrapping paper and examined the box, I came to a really tragic conclusion. This was not the gift I had expected. In fact, in my estimation, it was probably the most disappointing present I could have ever received. What I held in my hand was a box for a Norelco electric razor. I hadn't even grown facial hair yet. I was not the guy that you see before you today. But I did what I was taught to do. I mustered everything I had. I gathered all the strength that my little body possessed, and I summoned a smile and a thank you. Fast forward, and all the kids had received all of their gifts. all of their presents, their fun presents, I might add. And they're playing with them, and they're having a good time, and I'm sitting on the couch quietly, sulking and churning and watching all the other kids play. I felt betrayed. So I looked at the box once more. Maybe the shiny box would have some cool graphics highlighting some special technical quality that this razor possessed. Maybe this was a cutting-edge technological marvel. Nope, it was a Norelco men's razor. So I sat and I sat and I sulked and I sulked. And finally, after a while, my grandmother must have noticed that I'd been sitting on the couch quietly, and she must have seen my face and noticed that I looked kind of discontented. And she came up to me and she said, "What did you get for Christmas?" And I sheepishly held up the box. "A razor," I said with a trembling voice, trying not to cry. She looked at me and smiled. "A razor?" Then this woman, this magnificent woman, said something that struck me like a bolt of lightning. "Did you open the box?" Wait, what do you mean, open the box? It hadn't even occurred to me that I should open the box, that what was inside of the box may be different than the package in which it was wrapped. Never occurred to me that opening the box was part of the deal, that I had to do the work of unpacking the gift in order to fully appreciate what had been given. I was so fixated on my assumptions that I had made about the gift. The result then was discontent. And the discontent was not only with the gift, but I'll tell you a secret. It was also with the giver of the gift. In the narrative of Joshua chapter 17, verses 7 through 18, we encounter the descendants of Joseph grappling with the boundaries and the blessings allotted to them in this land of promise. Although they had received a generous inheritance, their lack of faith in God's power led them to grumble, focusing on obstacles rather than opportunities. Rather than embracing what God graciously provided, they fixated on the challenges posed by fortified cities and iron chariots, questioning whether their portion was truly sufficient. Their response reveals a deeper spiritual principle, that faith shapes our perception of God's gifts, and discontent is often rooted in our reluctance to trust Him fully. That leads me to the big idea of this morning's sermon, one which I tragically came to the conclusion of myself personally, that faithlessness leads to discontent. Maybe you've come to that conclusion in your own life once or twice. Faithlessness leads to discontent. Church, we are a magnificently blessed people, aren't we? I recently listened to an interview where a pretty well-known pastor said that Nebuchadnezzar would have given up to half of his kingdom for a 20-year-old Toyota Camry. And we're like, it's got a lot of miles on it. Right? And it struck me in a way that I don't think it had ever fully appreciated before. The technology that we have in our pockets, that we so take for granted, would have been regarded as magic only 100 years ago. It probably would have tossed you in water and watched to see if you floated. I don't know about you, but I'm almost at a place now where there's nothing that shocks me or surprises me anymore. Did you know that a couple of months ago, human beings actually performed alchemy? Do you know what alchemy is? Alchemy was a pseudoscience practiced by mystics and quacks who believed that with the right combination of chemicals, they could find a way to transform lead into gold. That was alchemy. Obviously, that could never happen, right? You could never turn lead into gold. Well, apparently, you can. Let me just read from the published article in Scientific American. Quote, "The dream of 17th century alchemists has been realized by physicists at the Large Hadron Collider, who would turn lead into gold, albeit for a fraction of a second and at tremendous cost. The not-so-mysterious transmutation happened at CERN, Europe's particle physics laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland, where the multi-billion-dollar Large Hadron Collider smashes together ions of lead for a portion of each experimental run. Early chemists hoped to turn abundant lead into precious gold. But differences in proton number between the elements, 82 for lead and 79 for gold, made that impossible by chemical means. CERN researchers achieved that feat by aiming beams of lead at each other, traveling at close to the speed of light. The ions occasionally glanced past each other, and rather than create a pulse of energy that triggers an oncoming lead nucleus, it instead ejected 3 protons, turning it into gold." That's crazy. It would not surprise me if scientists announced tomorrow that through gene editing, they were able to cure cancer. I don't think most people realize or understand the abundance that they have access to, because we're just sort of swimming in it every day, right? It's constantly coming at us. But I'm not just talking about technological or material abundance. I'm also talking about the abundance of God's grace and mercy. You have abundant mercy and grace from God. We are truly blessed. The Scripture teaches that we have been blessed in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. That means that through Christ we are heirs of God the Father. Do you have any idea what that means? How much does God the Father own? Is there anything that he doesn't own? No. And you are heirs with Christ of God the Father, of all things. Do you get that? I wonder if in all the richness of God's good grace and abundance, if we've not only lost our awe of technological advancement, but also perhaps an awe of God. I wonder if Christians have lost their appreciation for what we have as a gift, that what we've been given, at least in part. And that, at least in part, that discontent might arise from the fact that we've largely been distracted from our mission. You see, the church isn't simply to sit and wait patiently for Christ to return while the world falls apart around us. We are called to exert ourselves. And this happens in 2 ways, really. It happens through our own individual and corporate pursuit of holiness, and through the impact of our testimony as we act as salt and light in our communities. Our faithfulness in these twin pursuits will have the effect of deepening our appreciation for who God is and for the gifts that we have been given. By contrast, our faithlessness in stewarding the gospel, both in its impact in our lives and in the lives of our neighbors, will result in a growing discontent with God and his good gifts. If you're not on mission, it's very likely that you've become discontented or are easily discontented with God. There's something about our responsibility to act upon God's promises that solidifies our sense of appreciation. You see, it's not just enough to receive the gift. We have to unpack it. We have to open it up. And we have to take ownership of it. It has to become ours. We have to own it. It has to be a reality in our lives. This causes us to value what we have rather than covet what we don't have. Here in our text, we see the tribes of Joseph reveal their discontent with the land that they've been apportioned. And it's clear that much of their dissatisfaction is actually driven by their faithlessness. It's driven by their faithlessness. And that brings me to the question that I believe the text answers. The question is this: how were the boundaries of the tribes of Joseph established? Remember, there are two tribes of Joseph. There is Ephraim and Manasseh. And what we have here is the description of the allotment of the territories of these two tribes. So the question is, how were the boundaries of the tribes established? Well, first, they were established according to the size of Joseph's tribes. Look at verses 13 through 15 in our text. Verse 13 through 15. Now, when the people of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. Then the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, "Why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, although I am a numerous people, since all along the Lord has blessed me?" And Joshua said to them, "If you are a numerous people, go up by yourselves to the forest and clear ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you." So what's important to recognize here is that God, through Joshua, had allocated a tract of land that was sufficient for the size of the tribe. Unfortunately, within that land lived a community of Canaanites whom they were unable to drive out. So basically, the tribes of Joseph, which are Manasseh and Ephraim, come back to the table and petition Joshua to give them more land. In verse 13, we see that Ephraim and Manasseh have demonstrated their willingness to compromise on what God had commanded. They were told to utterly drive the Canaanites out of the land. However, when they were met with resistance, they abandoned God's command. They abandoned their responsibility to do what God had told them that they must do. And this is clearly spelled out in Exodus chapter 23, verse 33, where the Lord says, "They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." So the purpose of driving them out of the land wasn't rooted in some kind of ancient expression of racism. This was God's command, because he knew that the moment that these people were allowed to dwell in the land together with his people, they would begin to intermarry and adopt their idolatrous practices. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but how could the tribes be blamed if they, in fact, attempted to drive out the Canaanites but were unable to do so? It says there right in the text, they were unable to drive them out. Well, if you go back to the text and examine verse 13, you'll see that it states that while they were initially unable to drive out the Canaanites, eventually Israel grew strong and put them into forced labor. In other words, they gave up and later became accustomed to their presence. So accustomed were they to their presence that they finally, when they had the strength of numbers to accomplish the task, rather than fulfilling their mandate, they allowed the Canaanites to stay in the land, but made them slaves. Listen to what John Calvin writes about this. He says this, quote, "But another crime still less pardonable was committed when, having in their power easily to destroy all, they not only were slothful in executing the command of God, but induced by filthy lucre," which is money, "induced by filthy lucre, they preserved those alive whom God had doomed to destruction." So they were greedy and used them as forced labor. instead of doing what God had said and push them out of the land. So now they have another problem to contend with. Not only do they have these Canaanites dwelling in their land, but now they're going to be induced to idolatry because of their presence. So one compromise leads to the next problem. All the tribes of Joseph, all they would have had to do was to continue to prosecute the war that God had called them to fight. Instead, they become discontented with what God had given them as a blessing. Why? Because areas of their territory were occupied by Canaanites, and there was not enough room for them to spread out. I hope you can see the problem. There was, in fact, enough room for them. The issue wasn't the size of the tract of land that they were allotted. The issue was the fact that a portion of it was being occupied by various Canaanite tribes. And they weren't able to push them out, and they weren't willing to finish the job when they had the numbers. Look at the complaint in verse 14 again. Look at what it says. Then the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, "Why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, although I am a numerous people, since all along the Lord has blessed me?" Notice how they feign piety in the text. Look at me. Look how the Lord has blessed us. Look how numerous we are. We're so great. The case that they're making is that they ought to be given a different portion, or at least an additional portion of land, because they have been blessed by God. That's what they're trying. That's the case they're trying to make to Joshua. They are blessed by God, and He has made them very large. He has increased them at every turn. Therefore, they don't want what God has given them. They want something else. They want something more. They want something better. Now, at this point, we need to stop and do some critical thinking. Has God indeed blessed the tribes of Joseph? Yes. He has. God has made them a great people. In fact, Joshua himself was of the tribe of Ephraim. Did you know that? Joshua was an Ephraimite. You can imagine how the leaders of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh thought that their request was going to go over in the ears of Joshua. Right? He's one of our own. He's one of ours. They might have thought, we have a guy on the inside. Joshua's our guy. He's from Ephraim. We're just going to go up and we're going to remind him how great a nation we are. And we're going to stir up this national pride in Joshua and remind him how favored we are in the sight of God, and he will surely give us what we're asking for. And indeed, Joshua recognizes that they are a great people. Look at verse 15. He says, and Joshua said to them, "If you are a numerous people, go up by yourselves to the forest, and there clear ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you." In other words, you got this allotment because you are numerous. This is why you got this tract of land. There's a famous proverb which is not in the Bible, but made popular by a fictitious character named Uncle Ben. And that saying is, with great power comes great responsibility. And it seems like Joshua is acknowledging the basic premise of their argument. Look, you have great power. You're a numerous people. But now you have to take ownership. Be responsible. Do what God has commanded you to do. Instead of coming to me and asking for something else, something different, and using your blessing of God as a kind of justification for your request, why don't you take your blessing and go take possession of what God has given you? That's what Joshua is saying. Go into the land where the Perizzites are and take possession of it. Clear out the forest. Take possession of the land where the Rephaim are. By the way, those are likely giants. Go into that part. Take possession of it. Do the hard things. You have no excuse for rejecting God's blessing. Rather than focusing on the objectively good gift that God has given, they become paralyzed by their subjective perception of the gift with all of its apparent defects. Their faithlessness leads to discontent. Next, we see that the boundaries of the tribes of Joseph were also established according to the size of Joseph's God. Not just the size of Joseph's tribes, but also the size of Joseph's God. Look at verses 16 through 18. Let's go back to our text at verse 16. The people of Joseph said, "The hill country is not enough for us. Yet all the Canaanites who dwell in the plains have chariots of iron, both those in Beth-shean and its villages and those in the valley of Jezreel." Then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are a numerous people and have great power. You shall not have one allotment only, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess it to its farthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong." Take note of the fact that Joseph simply reiterates the boundaries of the land that were first described as belonging to the people. He's like, in case you missed it, these are the boundaries. This is what God has given you. So he reiterates the boundaries. This land is allotted by God's sovereign hand. It is distributed to them according to lot. If God wanted them to have a different territory, he would have given them a different territory. So Joshua's like, no, this is the land. You can't come back now and say, well, because there's Canaanites there, I'm going to give you something else. This is the land that God has given you. The fact that it was inhabited by Canaanites was already baked into the cake of God's sovereign will.